Welcome to the Warfront Stories World War II channel. Subscribe to our channel because every day we publish stories about the valor of American soldiers based on real events. Support us. Like our videos if you like what we do for you. August 7th, 1942. The sun rose over the South Pacific, casting a deceptive golden glow across the tranquil waters surrounding an obscure island called Guadalcanal. This remote piece of land, cloaked in dense jungle and surrounded by pristine beaches, was about to become the setting for one of history's most nightmarish military campaigns. Lieutenant Colonel Merritt Edson stood on the deck of the transport ship, his eyes fixed on the approaching shoreline. The veteran Marine officer had seen combat before, but something about this island made his skin crawl. Perhaps it was the unnatural stillness of the jungle, or the oppressive humidity that seemed to crush the lungs. Whatever it was, Edson couldn't shake the feeling that this place was waiting for them, hungry for them. "God help us all," he muttered as a landing craft began to drop into the water. The men of the 1st Marine Division were about to make history, the first American offensive of World War II. But what awaited them on this seemingly peaceful tropical island would test the very limits of human endurance. Over the next 6 months, 1,600 Marines would perish here. Thousands more would be forever haunted by what they experienced in this green hell. The Japanese had arrived first, building an airfield that threatened the Allied supply lines to Australia. Taking this airfield, later named Henderson Field, would be relatively easy. Holding it would unleash a level of sustained horror that none of these men had been prepared for. As the landing craft approached the shore, no one knew that they were heading into what would become known as Ironbottom Sound, a watery grave for dozens of warships and thousands of sailors. No one knew about the tropical diseases that would ravage their bodies, the starvation that would hollow their cheeks, or the relentless enemy that would attack from the darkened jungle. No one knew that on Guadalcanal, nature itself would become an enemy as merciless as any Japanese soldier. The Marines hit the beach, weapons ready, adrenaline pumping, their senses heightened for the coming fight. But the real horror was waiting. Waiting in the impenetrable jungle. Waiting in the mosquito-infested swamps. Waiting in the nights that would soon be illuminated by the muzzle flashes of rifles and the ghostly beams of searchlights from warships engaged in desperate battle. Guadalcanal would earn many names in the months to come. The Island of Death, Green Hell. But perhaps the most fitting description came from a Marine's letter home. "This is what the end of the world looks like. This is hell on earth." The landing itself was strangely quiet. Major General Alexander Vandegrift, commanding the 1st Marine Division, had expected resistance, but the beaches were eerily empty as his men came ashore. The Japanese construction workers and small garrison had fled inland, abandoning their nearly completed airfield. "It's too easy," Sergeant John Basilone muttered to his machine gun crew as they dug in on a perimeter around what would soon be renamed Henderson Field. "They'll be back. Count on it." The jungle around them seemed to whisper with malevolence. Massive banyan trees with their twisting aerial roots created nightmarish silhouettes against the sky. The dense vegetation trapped heat and humidity, creating a natural pressure cooker. Within hours, the Marines' uniforms were soaked through with sweat, their skin already developing the first signs of fungal infections that would plague them throughout the campaign. On the second day, Private Henry Ferguson of E Company was found screaming, slapping wildly at his arms and legs. When corpsmen restrained him, they discovered his skin was crawling with land leeches, dozens of them, having dropped from overhanging foliage to find their human feast. The sight of the writhing, blood-engorged parasites sent shudders through even the most hardened veterans. "Just a taste of what this place has in store for us," the battalion surgeon remarked grimly as he pulled the creatures off, each leaving a small, persistently bleeding wound. The Marines worked feverishly to secure the airfield, knowing its critical importance. The work was punishing in the tropical heat, with temperatures soaring above 100 degrees Fahrenheit and humidity creating a suffocating blanket around them. Several men collapsed from heat exhaustion. Others developed strange rashes that spread across their skin like wildfire. Then came August 9th, and with it, the first true horror of Guadalcanal. Shortly after midnight, Japanese Vice Admiral Mikawa's cruiser force swept into what would later be called Ironbottom Sound. In the pitch-black waters off Savo Island, American and Australian ships drifted, their crews unaware of the approaching catastrophe. The Battle of Savo Island lasted a mere 32 minutes, but in that half hour, the Imperial Japanese Navy delivered a crushing blow. 3 American heavy cruisers, USS Vincennes, USS Quincy, and USS Astoria, along with the Australian cruiser HMAS Canberra, were sunk or fatally damaged. Aboard the Quincy, Seaman Thomas Reynolds watched in terror as Japanese searchlights suddenly illuminated his ship, followed instantly by the thunder of naval guns and the shriek of torpedoes. The cruiser was caught in a deadly crossfire, 8-inch shells tearing through her hull and superstructure. Men were torn apart right in front of me, Reynolds would later recall in a naval inquiry. I saw Ensign Miller cut completely in half by a shell. The deck was slippery with blood, and the screams, God, the screams of the trapped and burning men below decks. His voice trailed off, the memory too painful to continue. When dawn broke on August 9th, over 1,000 Allied sailors were dead, their bodies drifting in the warm Pacific waters or trapped in the twisted metal coffins of their sinking ships. The waters were slick with oil and blood. The Marines on shore watched in mounting dread as the transport ships that had brought them, their lifeline for supplies and evacuation, hastily departed. Admiral Fletcher, concerned about the safety of his precious aircraft carriers, withdrew his naval forces, leaving the Marines stranded on the island with limited supplies and ammunition. "They've abandoned us," Private James Miller wrote in his diary that night. "We're alone on this godforsaken island, and something tells me the Japs are coming. Heaven help us, because the Navy sure as hell won't." His words would prove prophetic, for on the other side of the island, the first Japanese reinforcements were already coming ashore, and with them would come a nightmare beyond anything the Marines had yet experienced. The night of August 20th was unusually quiet. Too quiet. The constant chorus of insects that typically filled the jungle darkness had fallen silent, as if the creatures themselves sensed the approaching bloodshed. Colonel Kiyono Ichiki, commanding a detachment of over 900 elite Japanese infantry, had landed east of the Marine positions. Confident to the point of arrogance, he refused to wait for reinforcements, certain his force could sweep aside the Americans and recapture the airfield in a single night attack. The Marines, alerted by coast watchers, had prepared a defensive line along the Tenaru River. Actually, the Ilu River, misidentified on their maps. Machine guns were positioned to create interlocking fields of fire. Artillery was pre-registered. They waited. At 0130 hours, the Japanese attacked. The first sign was an eerie battle cry that rose from hundreds of throats, a chilling, inhuman sound that sent ice through the veins of even the most seasoned Marines. It didn't sound human, Corporal Anthony Zulo later wrote. It was like the wailing of the damned. What followed was a scene straight from a nightmare. Japanese soldiers, charging in near-suicidal waves, illuminated in the ghostly light of flares and muzzle flashes. They rushed the Marine lines across the sandbar at the river's mouth, stepping over their fallen comrades. Some carrying grenades strapped to bamboo poles, others wielding swords that gleamed momentarily in the flashing light. The Marines' Browning machine guns scythed through the attacking waves. The distinctive thump of Browning automatic rifles joined the cacophony, laying down curtains of lead that cut Japanese soldiers in half. But still they came. They just kept coming, walking over their own dead right into our bullets, Private Henry Benson recalled. It was like they had no fear of death, like they were already dead men walking. Throughout the night, the attacks continued. Japanese soldiers who reached the Marine lines engaged in savage hand-to-hand combat. In the darkness, lit only by flares and gunfire, men stabbed and clubbed and strangled each other. The sandbar became slick with blood, the water of the Tenarue turning red. Sergeant Thomas Jones described finding a Marine and Japanese soldier the next morning, locked in a macabre embrace, having stabbed each other simultaneously, both now frozen in death's rigor. As dawn broke on August 21st, the Marines counterattacked, flanking the Japanese position and closing a deadly trap. Colonel Ichiki, realizing the failure of his attack, committed ritual suicide, shooting himself rather than facing the disgrace of defeat. The aftermath was a tableau of horror that would sear itself into the memories of all who witnessed it. Over 800 Japanese soldiers lay dead, their bodies contorted in death, some still clutching weapons, others with arms raised in their final moments. "I had never seen so many dead," wrote Lieutenant Robert Leckie. "They lay in the grotesque attitudes of violent death, some with arms outflung, some huddled as if in pain, most with faces down in the mud or sand." The Marines suffered only 34 dead, but the psychological toll was immeasurable. The savagery of the fighting, the fanatical nature of the enemy who preferred death to surrender, these were grim harbingers of what was to come. Colonel Ichiki's banzai charge was the first of many nightmares that would unfold on Guadalcanal. But while the Marines could defeat human enemies, they were about to face adversaries against which rifles and machine guns offered no defense. While the Japanese forces regrouped for their next assault, a different kind of enemy began its silent, insidious attack on the Marines. Guadalcanal's tropical ecosystem harbored microscopic killers far deadlier than any Japanese bullet. The mosquitoes came first, clouds of them, descending at dusk like a living shroud over the Marine positions. Each carried the potential for disease, injecting malaria parasites with every bite. The mosquitoes were so thick you could grab a handful of air and catch a dozen, recalled Corporal Michael D. Benedetto. We'd slap them, dead on our arms and faces, until our skin was smeared with our own blood and crushed mosquito bodies. But for every one you killed, 20 more took its place. The Marine medical units quickly ran low on quinine and atabrine, the anti-malarial drugs that might have offered some protection. When supplies arrived, rumors spread that atabrine caused sexual impotence, leading many Marines to discreetly spit out the bitter yellow pills when corpsmen weren't looking. By early September, the first cases of malaria appeared. Men collapsed during patrols, their bodies racked with fever, shaking uncontrollably with chills despite the tropical heat. Temperatures soared to 106 degrees Fahrenheit, minds became delirious, and the afflicted cried out in fever dreams. William started screaming about Japanese soldiers coming through the walls of the aid station. Hospital corpsman Frank Turner recorded in his journal. "We had to restrain him. His fever was 105. By morning, his organs had failed." Nothing we could do. Dysentery followed, spreading rapidly through the Marine positions due to contaminated water and poor sanitation. Men weakened by malaria were especially vulnerable. The lucky ones made it to latrines. Many simply collapsed where they stood, involuntarily evacuating liquefied feces down their legs. "The stench was everywhere," Private Eugene Sledge wrote. "Men with dysentery couldn't control themselves. You'd be in a firefight, and suddenly the Marine next to you would groan, not from a wound, but from his bowels betraying him. The smell of feces mixed with the rotting jungle vegetation and the metallic scent of blood. It was the smell of death." Fungal infections flourished in the constant dampness. Jungle rot ate away at men's feet, creating weeping sores that refused to heal. Tiny ringworm spores found the perfect breeding ground in the warm, moist skin folds, creating circular patches of inflamed, itchy skin that spread rapidly across bodies. Lieutenant Colonel Louis Chesty Puller, commanding the 1st Battalion, 7th Marines, ordered daily foot inspections. What his officers found horrified them. Men with toes literally rotting away, fungal growths penetrating deep into tissue, maggots sometimes writhing in the most severe wounds. "A man can fight with a bullet wound," Puller grimly told his officers. "He can't fight if his feet are gone." Food shortages compounded the health crisis. After the initial naval withdrawal, supply ships made only sporadic visits, often unloading their precious cargo under Japanese air attack before rapidly departing. The Marines were reduced to 2 meals a day, then 1. Their rations supplemented by captured Japanese rice that sometimes contained weevils, or worse. Weight fell away from even the most robust Marines. Men who had arrived with muscular, healthy frames became walking skeletons, their eyes sunken, skin hanging from deteriorating muscle. "I didn't recognize Sanders when I saw him in the aid station," wrote Lieutenant James Patterson. "He'd lost maybe 40 pounds in 3 weeks. His cheeks were hollowed out, and there was a strange, vacant look in his eyes. It wasn't just physical. Something inside him had withered, too." By mid-September, nearly 2/3 of the Marine Division was affected by disease. Medical units were overwhelmed, with makeshift field hospitals filled beyond capacity. Men with combat wounds lay beside those delirious with malaria, all of them prey to the relentless mosquitoes that somehow found their way through any netting. And through it all, the Japanese kept coming, both from the jungle and from the sea. Night after night, Japanese warships would appear off the coast, bombarding Marine positions with impunity, the massive shells creating geysers of mud and body parts. "The worst was not knowing," Sergeant William Manchester later recalled. "Disease inside you, Japanese all around you. Shells coming from the darkness. You began to feel that death was inevitable. Not a question of if, but when, and how painful it would be." Yet even with their bodies and spirits under assault from these microscopic enemies, the Marines of Guadalcanal faced their greatest test in mid-September, when the Japanese launched their most determined effort yet to recapture Henderson Field. The jungle seemed to breathe in the darkness, the dense vegetation moving slightly with each humid gust of wind. The Marines of the 1st Raider Battalion and 1st Parachute Battalion lay in their foxholes along a jungle ridge south of Henderson Field, listening to the night. Lieutenant Colonel Merritt Edson had positioned his 840 men along this ridge, soon to be known as Bloody Ridge or Edson's Ridge, believing it to be the most likely avenue for the next Japanese attack. His superiors had been skeptical, but Edson's instincts would soon be proven tragically correct. Private Robert Youngblood lay shivering in his foxhole despite the tropical heat. Malaria had its grip on him, but there were no replacements, so he remained on the line, his M1 rifle clutched in trembling hands. "Something's out there," whispered the Marine sharing his foxhole. "Listen." Youngblood strained his ears and heard it. The subtle snap of twigs, the rustle of vegetation, not caused by wind. The Japanese were coming, thousands of them. Major General Kiyotake Kawaguchi had assembled a force of over 6,000 men, the main body of which was now moving through the jungle toward Edson's position. But the difficult terrain had separated Kawaguchi's units, and they were hours behind schedule. At 2100 hours on September 12, the Japanese artillery opened fire, shells crashing through the jungle canopy to explode among the Marine positions. Simultaneously, Japanese cruisers offshore began bombarding Henderson Field, the massive 14-inch shells from the cruisers Chokai and Kinugasa creating thunderous explosions that shook the earth. Under this covering fire, the first wave of Japanese infantry attacked. "They came out of the jungle like demons," Corporal James Davis would later write. Eyes wide, screaming those blood-curdling battle cries. The first wave had grenades strapped to the end of bamboo poles. Knee mortars, we called them. They'd plant the poles in the ground, and the grenades would pop up and explode over our foxholes. The raiders and parachutists opened fire with everything they had: Browning machine guns, BARs, rifles, even pistols, as the Japanese closed to hand-to-hand distance. The ridge erupted in muzzle flashes. the darkness broken by the strobe-like effect of hundreds of weapons firing at once. Lieutenant Colonel Edson moved constantly behind the lines, redirecting fire, ordering withdrawals from untenable positions, always calm despite the chaos erupting around him. I saw a Japanese officer charging directly at our position, Private Thomas Malloy recalled. He had a sword raised, and he was maybe 15 yards away when Colonel Edson appeared beside me, drew his pistol, and shot the man dead with a single round. He looked down at me and said, "Carry on, Private," as casual as if we were back in training, not in the middle of hell itself. Throughout the night, the battle seesawed across the ridge. Marine positions were overrun, then retaken. Men fought hand-to-hand in the darkness, often unable to distinguish friend from foe until they were close enough to see faces. Private Joseph Rodriguez found himself isolated when Japanese troops overran his squad's position. Hiding in the brush, he watched as wounded Marines were bayoneted where they lay. "They were methodical," he wrote in a letter home that was later found among his effects after he was killed in action. "They made sure each Marine was dead, stabbing them repeatedly. Williams was still alive. I could see him move. They took their time with him. I had to stuff my sleeve in my mouth to keep from screaming as they tortured him." By dawn, the Japanese had been repulsed, but they had come alarmingly close to breaking through to Henderson Field. The respite was brief. The following night, Kawaguchi launched an even larger assault. The fighting on the night of September 13th and 14th reached a level of savagery that defied description. Japanese soldiers, knowing this was their best chance to retake the airfield, fought with suicidal determination. Marines, aware that retreat meant the loss of Guadalcanal, refused to yield ground despite mounting casualties. The center of the Marine line began to buckle under the onslaught. Edson, recognizing the critical moment, personally led a counterattack that stabilized the position. Throughout the night, he moved among his men, seemingly indifferent to the bullets and shell fragments cutting through the air around him. "His voice was the only thing keeping us fighting," Sergeant Frank Lucas remembered. "Men were dropping left and right, but every time you thought about running, there was Colonel Edson, standing tall, telling us we were Marines, and Marines don't retreat." Dawn revealed a scene of carnage beyond comprehension. The ridge was literally covered with bodies. Over 600 Japanese dead, sprawled in the positions where they had fallen. Marines moved carefully among them, checking for survivors, occasionally firing a mercy shot when they found Japanese soldiers still alive, but mortally wounded. The Marines had held, but at terrible cost. Over 100 raiders and parachutists were dead. Scores more wounded. Those still capable of fighting were hollow-eyed with exhaustion, many having gone without sleep for over 48 hours. Private Youngblood, his malaria momentarily forgotten in the intensity of combat, found himself standing over a Japanese officer he had killed during the night. Something about the man's expression, a mixture of determination and fear frozen in death, struck him. "They're just men too," he said quietly to no one in particular. "Under different circumstances, we might have been friends." A passing sergeant overheard him and placed a hand on his shoulder. "Save your philosophy, young blood. There's more of them coming. There's always more coming." Indeed, even as the Marines consolidated their positions and evacuated their wounded, Japanese forces were regrouping in the jungle. The battle for Guadalcanal was far from over. The Matanacao River cut through the jungle west of the marine perimeter, its murky waters hiding dangers both natural and man-made. Crocodiles lurked beneath the surface, occasionally claiming unwary Marines who ventured too close to the banks. But far deadlier predators waded across the river. Japanese forces gathering for yet another attempt to dislodge the Americans from Henderson Field. On October 7, 1942, elements of the 5th and 7th Marine Regiments launched an offensive across the Matanacao, aiming to disrupt Japanese preparations for their next major attack. What began as a probing action quickly evolved into one of the most harrowing experiences of the campaign. The Marines crossed the river under covering fire, moving up the steep jungle slopes on the far bank. Private Lawrence Miller, a replacement who had arrived only 2 weeks earlier, was stunned by the physical condition of the veterans around him. "They looked like walking corpses," he wrote in his journal. Skin yellow from atabrine and jaundice, uniforms rotting off their bodies, ribs visible through their shirts. But the way they moved through the jungle, like ghosts. You could tell they'd been fighting here for weeks. The Japanese allowed the Marines to advance about 500 yards beyond the river before unleashing their ambush. Hidden machine gun positions opened fire simultaneously, catching whole platoons in devastatingly accurate crossfire. Japanese mortars, pre-registered on likely avenues of approach, began dropping high explosive rounds with pinpoint precision. "It was a slaughter," recalled Sergeant Henry Ross, one of the few survivors for my company. "Martinez took a machine gun burst that nearly cut him in half. Williams and Thompson were hit by the same mortar round. There wasn't enough left of them to identify. We were in a killing zone, with no cover." Lieutenant Colonel Lewis Chesty Puller, commanding the 1st Battalion 7th Marines, found his unit cut off and surrounded. Rather than attempt a breakout, Puller established a 360-degree defensive perimeter on a small hill, radioing for naval gunfire support. The destroyer USS Monson responded, moving dangerously close to shore to bring its 5-inch guns to bear on Japanese positions. The naval shells screamed overhead, some passing so close to the Marines' position that they could feel the heat of their passage. "The shells were landing less than 100 yards from our lines," Corporal David James remembered. "The concussion would pick you up and slam you back down. Dirt and tree fragments rained down on us. But as terrifying as our own artillery was, it was the only thing keeping the Japanese from overrunning us." As night fell, the situation grew more desperate. Japanese infiltrators probed the American lines, crawling silently through the undergrowth, dispatching sentries with knives or garrots. Marines fired at shadows, sometimes hitting their own men in the confusion. Private Ryan Wheeler found himself facing a Japanese soldier who had somehow penetrated to within 10 feet of his foxhole. In the dim moonlight, Wheeler could make out the gleam of a bayonet fixed to the man's rifle. "I tried to bring my rifle up, but he was too fast," Wheeler later told a field hospital corpsman. "He lunged forward and I felt the bayonet enter my abdomen. I thought I was dead for sure. But then Sanders came out of nowhere and tackled him. They fought hand to hand, no weapons, just 2 men trying to kill each other with their bare hands. Sanders finally managed to get the Japanese soldier's head between his arms and broke his neck. But by then Sanders had been stabbed multiple times. He died right next to me, choking on his own blood." The morning of October 8th brought little relief. Japanese snipers, secured high in the jungle canopy, picked off Marines who exposed themselves even momentarily. The distinctive crack of Arisaka rifles was followed almost instantly by the impact of 6.5mm bullets, creating terrible wounds that the battalion's corpsmen struggled to treat with dwindling medical supplies. By midday, with ammunition running critically low, Puller made the decision to attempt a breakout. Using the last of their mortar rounds and grenades to create a momentary diversion, the Marines fought their way back to the Matanakaw, carrying their wounded while laying down suppressive fire. The river crossing became another horror. Japanese machine guns swept the water with sustained bursts, turning the surface into a churning froth of bullets and blood. Marines tried to swim while holding their wounded comrades, many drowning under the weight of equipment or being dragged down by the strong current. The water was red with blood, Lieutenant Thomas Grady wrote. Men were screaming for help, but there was nothing we could do for most of them. I saw Donovan trying to swim with Patterson on his back. Patterson had taken a round through both legs. A burst of machine gun fire hit them both. They went under and never came back up. By nightfall, the remnants of the Marine force had made it back to friendly lines. The failed operation had cost over 120 Marine lives, with dozens more missing and presumed dead. But the action had revealed valuable intelligence about Japanese dispositions, information that would prove crucial in the coming weeks. For the survivors, the horror of the Matanakaw would never fully fade. The image of comrades drowning or being cut down by machine gun fire as they struggled across the river would return in nightmares for decades to come. Some nights, I still wake up choking, feeling like I'm drowning in that river. Corporal James Mendoza told an interviewer in 1975, over 30 years after the battle. I can still see their faces, the men we couldn't save. They haunt me. The battle for the Matanico was just one more bloody chapter in the unfolding nightmare of Guadalcanal. But the worst was yet to come. Henderson Field, the very reason for the American presence on Guadalcanal, had become both sanctuary and prison. The crude airstrip, carved from former coconut plantations, was the only means of air support for the Marines and their best hope for evacuation if the situation deteriorated further. By mid-October, conditions around the airfield had reached a new level of misery. Constant Japanese bombing raids had turned the surrounding area into a cratered moonscape. The stench of death permeated everything. Decomposing bodies that couldn't be recovered from no man's land, human waste from overflowing latrines, gangrene from untreated wounds. "The smell is indescribable," wrote Lieutenant James Crawford. "It gets into your clothes, your skin, your hair. You taste it with every breath. After a while, you stop noticing it, which is perhaps the most horrifying thing of all, becoming accustomed to the odor of death." The night of October 13th brought a new terror. Japanese battleships Haruna and Kongo, escorted by a screen of destroyers, approached Guadalcanal undetected. At 0130 hours, they opened fire with their massive 14-inch guns, targeting Henderson Field from just offshore. The bombardment was unlike anything the Marines had experienced. Each shell created an explosion that lifted men bodily from the ground, the concussion rupturing eardrums and causing internal hemorrhaging even for those not directly hit. The Japanese fired over 900 shells in less than 2 hours, systematically destroying aircraft, fuel dumps, ammunition stores, and command posts. Private Michael Sullivan, sheltering in a slit trench near the runway, described the experience. "The world became a constant explosion. The ground heaved like it was alive. Men around me were screaming, but you couldn't hear them over the shell bursts. Johnson, right next to me, just disappeared. One second he was there, the next there was nothing but a smoking hole. I found pieces of him 50 yards away the next morning." When dawn broke, Henderson Field was a smoking ruin. Over 40 Marines were dead, dozens more wounded. Of the 90 aircraft that had been operational the previous day, only 42 remained. Worst of all, the main fuel depot had been hit, with over 80% of the aviation fuel destroyed. Major Robert Gaylor, commanding a fighter squadron, surveyed the damage with hollow eyes. "How are we supposed to fly combat missions with no fuel?" he asked no one in particular. "Those Zeros will own the skies now." Indeed, the Japanese wasted no time in exploiting their advantage. Within hours of the naval bombardment, waves of Betty bombers appeared overhead, escorted by Zero fighters. With most American aircraft grounded due to fuel shortages, the Japanese bombed at leisure, further cratering the runway and destroying repair facilities. Marine anti-aircraft gunners fought back desperately, the thump of their 40mm Bofors guns providing the only resistance. Occasional Marine fighters managed to take off on the fuel that remained, their pilots knowing they might not have enough to return. Captain Joe Foss, who would eventually become one of the top American aces of the war, took off in his F-4F Wildcat during one such raid. "It was suicide, and we all knew it," his wingman Lieutenant Thomas Furlow later recounted. "We had enough fuel for maybe 20 minutes of flight time. But Joe said, better to die fighting than sitting in a hole waiting for a bomb." He shot down 2 Bettys before running out of fuel and having to ditch in the Sound. Miraculously, Foss survived his water landing and was rescued by a patrol boat. Others were not so fortunate. Throughout this aerial siege, Japanese ground forces continued probing the Marine perimeter, keeping the defenders in a constant state of alertness despite their exhaustion. Sleep became a luxury few could afford, and those who did manage to close their eyes were haunted by vivid nightmares. "When I do sleep, I dream of home," Corporal David Martinez wrote in a letter never sent. "But then the dream changes, and home is here. My parents' house overrun with Japanese soldiers. My mother and sister screaming as they're bayoneted. I wake up shaking, almost preferring to stay awake despite being so tired I can barely stand." The physical and psychological strain was taking an increasingly severe toll. Cases of combat fatigue, what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder, multiplied. Men who had been rock-solid reliable suddenly broke, sometimes curling into fetal positions during firefights, others lashing out violently at their comrades for minor provocations. Sergeant William Manchester found one of his men, Private Ellis, sitting in a bomb crater, methodically disassembling his rifle, while Japanese mortar rounds landed nearby. "Ellis, what the hell are you doing?" Manchester shouted over the explosions. "Get to cover!" Ellis looked up with vacant eyes. "It doesn't matter, Sarge. We're already dead. This is hell. We died a long time ago and just don't know it yet." Manchester had to physically drag Ellis to shelter, the private laughing hysterically the entire time. Medical officers were overwhelmed not just with physical wounds, but with psychological casualties. With no means of evacuation for all but the most severely injured, men with profound mental trauma remained on the line, posing dangers to themselves and others. "We've got men who are complete psychological wrecks still manning machine guns," a Navy psychiatrist attached to the division wrote in his official report. "In any other circumstance, they'd be immediately removed from combat and given intensive treatment. Here, we give them a sedative if we have any left, tell them to hold it together, and send them back to the front. It's unconscionable, but there's no alternative." Yet despite the bombardment, the bombing, the probing attacks, and their own deteriorating mental states, the Marines held. Henderson Field, though battered, remained operational, and in the jungle south of the airfield, Japanese forces were massing for what they believed would be the final, decisive attack. The Marines could sense it coming. Like animals before an earthquake, they could feel the approaching storm. Veterans made their peace, wrote final letters home, traded small personal items as remembrances. "If I don't make it, tell my sister she can have my record collection," Private Thomas Jenkins told his friend, Corporal Ray Martinez. "But make sure she plays the Glenn Miller first. That was always my favorite." Such conversations occurred throughout the Marine lines, as men prepared for what many believed would be their last battle. The Japanese were coming, and this time, they were coming with everything they had. On the night of October 23, 1942, the jungle south of Henderson Field seemed to hold its breath. Even the constant chorus of insects fell silent, as if nature itself sensed the impending slaughter. The Japanese 17th Army, under the command of Lieutenant General Harukichi Hyakutake, had assembled over 20,000 men for what they expected to be the decisive attack of the campaign. Their objective remained the same: capture Henderson Field at all costs. Marine listening posts detected the Japanese approach well before visual contact. Private Lawrence Ahern, manning a forward observation post with 2 other Marines, heard the unmistakable sounds of a large force moving through the jungle. "There's thousands of them coming," he whispered into his radio before disconnecting and preparing to fall back to the main lines. But it was already too late. Japanese advance scouts had detected the Marine position and surrounded it. What happened next was pieced together from Japanese accounts captured later in the war. The 3 Marines were taken alive, their hands bound with communication wire. A Japanese officer, determined to extract information about Marine defenses, ordered their interrogation. When the Marines refused to divulge any information beyond name, rank, and serial number, the officer ordered an object lesson. The youngest Marine, PFC Thomas Wilson, was bayoneted repeatedly while his comrades were forced to watch. Even as he died, Wilson maintained his silence. The remaining 2 Marines met similar fates, their bodies discovered 3 days later with evidence of prolonged torture before execution. Their sacrifice, however, had purchased precious time for the main Marine lines to prepare. The initial Japanese assault fell primarily on the sector defended by the 1st Battalion, 7th Marines, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Louis Chesty Puller. The defensive position was anchored around a low ridge that provided clear fields of fire into the surrounding jungle. Puller had predicted the Japanese attack route and pre-registered his artillery on likely assembly areas. When Japanese forces began emerging from the jungle in battalion strength, he immediately called down a barrage from the 105mm howitzers of the 11th Marines. The artillery caught them in the open, Sergeant Frank Mitchell recalled. The shells fell right in their formations. You could hear the screams even over the explosions. Body parts were flying through the air. But they kept coming, stepping over their dead, not even trying to take cover. As the Japanese closed to within small arms range, Marine machine gunners opened fire. The heavy Browning .30 caliber guns, some mounted on tripods and others on sandbags, laid down interlocking fields of fire that turned the approaching ground into a killing field. Corporal John Basilone, commanding a machine gun section, became a legend that night. When Japanese fire disabled one of his guns, he carried a replacement weighing over 90 pounds through enemy fire to restore his section's firepower. Later, when ammunition ran low, he fought his way through Japanese lines to resupply his gunners. Basilone was everywhere, Private Robert Johnston wrote afterward. He seemed to have no fear. Japanese soldiers were within 20 yards of our position, and he was moving between guns, clearing jams, replacing barrels, directing fire. He personally killed at least a dozen enemy with his pistol when they got too close to the guns. Despite suffering horrendous casualties, the Japanese pressed their attack. Fresh battalions were fed into the battle as others were decimated, the Japanese commanders showing a callous disregard for human life that shocked even the battle-hardened Marines. "They're using their dead as cover," Lieutenant Thomas Jenkins shouted to his platoon as another wave of attackers emerged from the darkness. "Aim low!" Indeed, Japanese soldiers were advancing behind mounds of their own dead comrades, using the corpses as shields against Marine fire. It was a tactic born of desperation and fanaticism, and it allowed some attackers to reach the Marine lines. What followed was hand-to-hand combat of the most savage kind. In the darkness, illuminated only by flares and muzzle flashes, men fought with bayonets, entrenching tools, knives, and bare hands. Private Henry Williams found himself grappling with a Japanese officer who had leapt into his foxhole. The man's sword had broken off near the hilt, but he used the jagged remainder as a stabbing weapon, driving it repeatedly into Williams' shoulder and chest. "I couldn't reach my rifle," Williams told a hospital corpsman later, "so I grabbed his throat with both hands and just squeezed. He was stabbing me the whole time, but eventually his movements got weaker. I didn't let go until dawn. When light came, I was still holding a dead man by the throat, covered in both our blood." Similar desperate struggles occurred up and down the Marine lines. The fighting was so close that artillery and mortar support became impossible for fear of hitting friendly forces. It came down to Marines and Japanese locked in primordial combat, fighting for survival with a savagery that belied their supposed civilization. The battle reached its crescendo around 0300 hours when a Japanese force nearly a battalion in strength managed to penetrate between two Marine companies, threatening to roll up the American flank. Colonel Puller, recognizing the critical moment, personally led a counterattack with his headquarters staff and any Marines he could gather. "Follow me!" he shouted as he charged forward, pistol in hand, into the mass of Japanese infantry. It was a moment of insane courage, a gesture that should have resulted in his immediate death. But the sheer audacity of the counterattack, combined with the charismatic leadership of Puller, galvanized the Marines. The Japanese breakthrough was contained and then eliminated in savage fighting, that sometimes had Marines and Japanese soldiers intermingled so closely that they couldn't use firearms for fear of hitting their own men. I saw Colonel Puller stab a Japanese soldier with a trench knife, Corporal Michael Sullivan reported. The colonel, a full-bird colonel, was in the thick of it like a private. It's why we would have followed him into hell itself. Dawn revealed a scene from the most terrible circles of Dante's Inferno. The ground before the Marine lines was carpeted with Japanese dead, in places stacked 3 and 4 bodies deep. Blood had soaked the earth, turning the dirt into a red mud that sucked at the boots of those who moved through it. The Japanese attack had been shattered, with over 3,500 of their soldiers dead, hundreds more wounded and dying in the jungle where they had crawled seeking escape. Marine losses were significantly lighter, but still severe. 86 killed and over 200 wounded. They had almost broken through, Lieutenant Edward Thomas wrote in his report. If not for the incredible courage of ordinary Marines, Guadalcanal would have been lost that night. Even as Marines collected dog tags from their dead comrades and corpsmen tended the wounded, everyone knew that the Japanese would return. This attack had been repulsed, but the enemy's determination remained unbroken. As if to emphasize this point, Japanese artillery began falling on the Marine positions around noon, a reminder that the battle for Henderson Field and for Guadalcanal itself was far from over. While the Marines fought desperately to hold Henderson Field, an equally terrible battle raged in the waters surrounding Guadalcanal. What began as Savo Sound would soon earn a more ominous name, Ironbottom Sound, for the dozens of warships and thousands of sailors who would find their final resting place in its depths. The Naval Battle of Guadalcanal, fought from November 12 through 15, 1942, represented the climactic naval engagement of the campaign. Both the American and Japanese navies committed their most powerful surface vessels, recognizing that control of the seas around Guadalcanal would ultimately determine the island's fate. The Japanese assembled a powerful force, 2 battleships, Hiei and Kirishima, along with numerous cruisers and destroyers. Their mission was to bombard Henderson Field into oblivion, clearing the way for a massive troop landing that would overwhelm the Marine defenders. The Americans, alerted by coast watchers and aerial reconnaissance, scrambled to intercept. Admiral Daniel Callahan commanded a mixed force of cruisers and destroyers, significantly outgunned by the Japanese battleships, but the only Allied naval force available on short notice. The stage was set for one of the most confusing and savage night naval battles in history. The opposing forces made contact shortly after midnight on November 13th. In the pitch darkness, with radar still in its infancy and communications hampered by the need for radio silence, the American and Japanese ships blundered into each other at point-blank range. It was absolute chaos, recalled Lieutenant Raymond Davis, serving aboard the light cruiser USS Helena. Ships were firing in every direction. Searchlights cut through the darkness. You couldn't tell friend from foe. We nearly collided with the San Francisco while both ships were firing at different targets. The battle quickly devolved into a swirling melee. Ships maneuvered desperately to avoid collision while bringing their guns to bear. Salvos were fired at ranges so close that gun crews could see their targets with the naked eye, a virtually unprecedented situation in modern naval warfare. Aboard the USS Laffey, a destroyer that found itself alongside the battleship Hiei, Seaman James Miller witnessed a scene straight from the age of sail, rather than modern naval combat. "We were so close I could see individual Japanese sailors on their deck," he wrote in a letter discovered after his death. "Our captain ordered us to fire everything we had, main guns, anti-aircraft guns, even sidearms. I fired my .45 pistol at their bridge. They were firing back with everything from 14-inch guns down to rifles. Men were being cut in half right beside me." The noise was beyond description. The Laffey landed multiple shell hits on Hiei's superstructure before a 14-inch shell from the battleship struck the destroyer's bow, nearly tearing it off. Moments later, a torpedo slammed into the Laffey's midsection, breaking the vessel's back. Seaman Thomas Jenkins was below decks when the torpedo hit. "The ship seemed to lift out of the water," he later testified. Then came the flooding. It was instantaneous, a solid wall of seawater moving faster than you can imagine, carrying debris, oil, and body parts. Men were screaming in the darkness as compartments flooded. I managed to find a ladder and climb toward the main deck, but others weren't so lucky. I could hear them drowning below me, calling for help that couldn't come. Jenkins was one of the few survivors from the Laffey, rescued after spending 7 hours in the oil-covered waters. Many of his shipmates were not so fortunate, either going down with the ship or falling victim to sharks that prowled the Sound, attracted by blood and movement. The flagship, USS San Francisco, found itself in an equally desperate situation, engaged with multiple Japanese vessels, including the Hiei. A Japanese salvo struck the cruiser's bridge, killing Admiral Callahan, Captain Casson Young, and most of the senior officers instantly. The bridge became a slaughterhouse, reported Lieutenant Commander Bruce McCandless, who assumed command after the carnage. Body parts were scattered everywhere. Blood was pooling on the deck. But even in that horror, there were acts of incredible courage. I saw a signalman, both legs severed, using his belt as a tourniquet while continuing to relay messages until he bled out. The brutality of the battle was magnified by the close ranges. Ships fired at each other from distances measured in hundreds rather than thousands of yards. Armor-piercing shells sometimes passed entirely through smaller vessels without detonating, while high-explosive rounds created horrific casualties among exposed personnel. By dawn, the battle had ended in a bloody draw. The Americans had lost 2 cruisers and 4 destroyers, with Admiral Callahan among the nearly 1,400 sailors killed. The Japanese had suffered damage to the battleship Hiei, which would be finished off by aircraft from Henderson Field the next day, and had been prevented from bombarding the airfield. A tactical victory for the Americans, bought at terrible cost. The naval battle resumed on the night of November 14 through 15, when Japanese Admiral Nobutake Kondo led another force centered around the battleship Kirishima toward Guadalcanal. This time, the Americans had their own battleships in play, USS Washington and USS South Dakota, commanded by Admiral Willis Ching Lee. What followed was another confused night action, with the South Dakota suffering electrical failures that rendered her radar and gun directors inoperative. Taking multiple hits from Japanese vessels, the South Dakota might have been lost if not for the Washington, which maneuvered undetected to within 8,400 yards of the Kirishima. In a brutally efficient display of naval gunnery, Washington landed at least 9 16-inch shell hits on Kirishima, turning the Japanese battleship into a burning wreck that would sink the following day. With the loss of their second battleship, the Japanese abandoned their attempts to neutralize Henderson Field by naval bombardment. The Marines ashore had been saved, but Ironbottom Sound had claimed thousands more lives, with sunken ships and their entombed crews resting on the ocean floor. For survivors like Seaman Raymond Davis, who spent 14 hours floating among the debris and bodies before rescue, the horror of Ironbottom Sound would never fade. The worst was the sharks, he told a Navy psychiatrist months later. They came at night. You'd hear someone scream, then splashing, then nothing. By morning there were fewer of us. Some men simply gave up, letting themselves sink beneath the surface. Others went mad from drinking seawater and swam away into the darkness. I survived by clinging to a piece of flotsam and praying. But sometimes I wonder if the men who sank with their ships weren't the lucky ones. They died quickly. Some of us died 1,000 times that night. The decisive American naval victory marked the turning point of the Guadalcanal campaign. Though fighting would continue for months, the Japanese had lost their best chance to recapture the island. But for the Marines ashore, the nightmare was far from over. By December 1942, the Marines who had landed on Guadalcanal in August were shadows of their former selves. 4 months of combat, disease, and malnutrition had reduced the 1st Marine Division to a collection of walking wounded. Men who had arrived weighing 180 pounds now tipped the scales at barely 130. Uniforms hung from gaunt frames. Hollow eyes stared from faces aged decades beyond their years. "We look like concentration camp victims," Sergeant William Manchester wrote in his diary. "Our skin is yellow from atabrine and jaundice. Our uniforms are rotting off our bodies. The new army replacements stare at us like we're already ghosts." Indeed, army units had begun arriving to relieve the Marines, fresh troops shocked by the condition of the men they were replacing. Private Henry Johnson of the Americal Division recalled his first encounter with a Marine patrol returning from the jungle. "They didn't look human anymore," he wrote to his parents. "They moved like old men, though none of them could have been over 25. Their eyes had this 1,000-yard stare, like they were looking at something terrible that only they could see. One of them stopped and said to me, 'You'll look like this too soon enough.' I prayed he was wrong, but I had a horrible feeling he wasn't." The Japanese forces were in even worse condition. Cut off from effective resupply by American control of the sea and air around Guadalcanal, Japanese troops were starving to death in the jungle. Reduced to eating roots, bark, and occasionally their own dead, the once proud Imperial Army had been reduced to a collection of scarecrows. Captured Japanese diaries revealed the extent of their suffering. One entry, found on the body of a Japanese officer, read, "Our situation is truly desperate. We have not had rice for 2 weeks. Men are eating grass and leaves. Many can no longer stand. Yesterday, Sergeant Yamamoto died of starvation. His body disappeared in the night. No one asks where it went. We all know, but we do not speak of it." Japanese medical facilities, primitive to begin with, had completely broken down. Wounded men lay untreated, developing infections that turned gangrenous in the tropical heat. Without antibiotics, even minor wounds often proved fatal. A Marine patrol discovered one Japanese field hospital hidden in a cave. What they found defied description. "The stench hit us before we even entered," Corporal David Martinez reported. Inside, there were maybe 40 Japanese soldiers in various stages of dying. Maggots were crawling in their wounds. Some had gangrene so advanced their limbs were black and rotting. A few were strong enough to reach for weapons when they saw us, but most just lay there, watching us with dead eyes. Our corpsmen said there was nothing we could do for most of them. The merciful thing would have been to end their suffering, but we left them as we found them. Even after all they'd done to our guys, nobody had the stomach for that. By January 1943, Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo had recognized the inevitable. Guadalcanal could not be held. The decision was made to evacuate all surviving Japanese forces from the island, an admission of defeat that senior officers found difficult to accept. The evacuation, codenamed Operation KE, began in late January. Japanese destroyers made night runs to designated beaches, taking off as many troops as possible while avoiding American air attacks. The operation was conducted with remarkable skill, the Japanese Navy demonstrating the same prowess in retreat that they had shown in attack. For Marines and soldiers patrolling the jungle, the signs of Japanese withdrawal were evident. Enemy positions that had been fiercely defended were found abandoned. Emaciated Japanese corpses became an increasingly common sight. Soldiers who had died of starvation or disease while trying to reach evacuation beaches. "They're pulling out," Lieutenant Robert Leckie told his platoon as they examined a recently abandoned Japanese bunker. "But don't get careless. The ones that are left have nothing to lose." His warning proved prescient. While most remaining Japanese troops were focused solely on survival and evacuation, others conducted a fanatical rear-guard action, determined to kill as many Americans as possible before their own inevitable deaths. Corporal Thomas Jenkins, leading a patrol near the Matanakaw River, encountered one such group. The Japanese soldiers, though clearly starving and ill, launched themselves at the Marine patrol with suicidal determination. "They came at us screaming, just skin and bones with rifles and bayonets," Jenkins later reported. "We cut them down easily. They were too weak to be effective. But the look in their eyes? They knew they were going to die, and they just wanted to take some of us with them. It was both terrifying and pitiful. By February 8, 1943, the Japanese evacuation was complete. In a remarkable feat of planning and execution, they had extracted over 10,000 men from the island, though many thousands more had perished during the campaign. The following day, February 9, American forces declared Guadalcanal secure. For the surviving Marines of the 1st Division, the news brought little joy. They were too exhausted, too traumatized to celebrate. The division had suffered over 650 killed in action and 1,278 wounded. But these figures told only part of the story. More than 8,500 Marines had been hospitalized with malaria and other tropical diseases. Many would suffer relapses for years to come. The psychological toll was harder to quantify. Combat fatigue, what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder, affected nearly everyone who had served on the island. Nightmares, flashbacks, uncontrollable rages, and debilitating anxiety would haunt Guadalcanal veterans for the rest of their lives. Private Michael Sullivan, one of the few members of his original platoon to survive the campaign, expressed the feelings of many as he boarded the transport that would take him from Guadalcanal. "I feel nothing," he wrote in his diary. "Not relief, not happiness, not even sadness for the friends I lost. It's like something inside me died on that island, and I don't know if it will ever come back. I keep thinking I should be grateful to be leaving alive, but all I can think is, part of me will never leave this place. The real me is buried on Guadalcanal with all the others." As the last Marine units departed, they left behind crude cemeteries filled with white crosses. Nearly 1,600 Americans lay buried in Guadalcanal's blood-soaked soil, along with thousands of Japanese whose remains would never be properly recovered or identified. The jungle, momentarily pushed back by the human conflict, began to reclaim the battlefield. Vines crept over abandoned bunkers. Rains erased foxholes. Nature commenced its patient work of covering the scars of war. But for those who fought there, Guadalcanal would never recede into memory. It would remain with them. A green hell of jungle rot, malarial fever, starvation, and terror, until their dying days. 70 years after the last shots were fired on Guadalcanal, David Martinez returned to the island. Now in his 90s, the former Marine corporal walked with a cane, his once powerful frame bent by age. He had come back, he said, to make peace with the ghosts. The Guadalcanal he found bore little resemblance to the nightmarish place he remembered. The jungle had reclaimed most of the battlefield. Henderson Field was now a modern airport serving Honiara, the capital city of the Solomon Islands. Tourists lounged on the beaches where Marines had once fought and died. Martinez stood on the ridge where Edson's raiders had made their stand in September 1942. A simple monument now marked the site, but otherwise there was little to suggest the desperate struggle that had occurred here. "It's so quiet now," he said to his grandson, who had accompanied him on the journey. "You can't imagine what it was like. The noise, the fear, the smell. You just can't imagine it." He walked slowly to the edge of the ridge, looking down toward what had once been Henderson Field. 70 years ago, he had been a 20-year-old corporal, fighting for his life as waves of Japanese soldiers charged his position. Now he was an old man trying to reconcile memory with the peaceful scene before him. "We were just boys," he said softly. "So many never got to grow old. Fenton, Williams, Rodriguez, Thompson, they're still here, still young, while I've lived a whole lifetime." Martinez was one of the dwindling number of Guadalcanal veterans still alive to bear witness. Each year, there were fewer. Soon, there would be none. But the island held their stories in its soil, tales of courage, suffering, endurance, and horror that defied comprehension. Historians would record the facts that the Guadalcanal campaign marked the first major offensive by Allied forces against Japan, that it represented a turning point in the Pacific War, that it cost the Japanese over 24,000 dead and the Allies about 1,600, not counting those who succumbed to disease. But statistics could never capture the full truth of Guadalcanal. They could not convey the terror of lying in a foxhole while Japanese soldiers probed the lines at night. They could not describe the misery of malarial fever or the agony of dysentery. They could not express the bone-deep fatigue of men fighting for months without adequate food, medical care, or rest. And they could not explain how human beings endured such conditions, how they found the strength to continue when death seemed not just possible, but probable. People asked me if we were heroes, Martinez said as he laid a small stone on the monument. I tell them no. We were just men who did what we had to do because the alternative was unthinkable. The real heroes never made it off this island. He stood silently for a moment, lost in memories visible only to him. Then he straightened as much as his aged back would allow and rendered a crisp salute to ghosts only he could see. The jungle whispered in response, the soft rustling of leaves like the murmured acknowledgement of the dead. Perhaps, somewhere in that verdant growth, the spirits of young men, American and Japanese alike, still stood their lonely posts, forever bound to this island that had claimed their futures. For them, Guadalcanal was not history. It was eternity. As Martinez turned to leave, he paused for one final look across the landscape that had claimed his youth and haunted his dreams for 7 decades. "Goodbye, boys," he said quietly. "Rest easy. The living haven't forgotten." Then he walked away, leaving Guadalcanal to its memories, its ghosts, and its place in history as the stage for one of the most horrific campaigns ever fought. A true hell on earth. Thank you for listening. If you are also proud of the bravery of our soldiers, subscribe to our channel so you don't miss out on new historical stories.